I'm joined now by Lord David Alton, who's been a member of the British Parliament since 1979.
1979.
And he's here with us in Ireland to speak at the Pro-Life Campaign's national conference. He's authored 12 books and has been a tireless human rights campaigner, especially on the issue of protecting the right to life. Lord Alton, thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleasure.
So, you have lived and been a part of Parliament for such a long time, and abortion has been in the UK since 1967. Many people have said Ireland is behind the times and we're in the dark ages because we didn't legalise abortion around the same time as our neighbours in the UK. What's your response to that?
Well, the reverse is true. Ireland has been ahead of the times, both in the north and south, because abortion hasn't applied here, and look at the lives that have been saved as a result. In Northern Ireland, it's the perfect test case, because the 1967 Act was never applied there. There are 100,000 people alive today, that is 5% of its population, who would be dead if the 1967 Act had applied. And what's happened in Britain? During that same period, 8.8 million babies have been aborted. You can't really comprehend that.
Twice our population.
Twice the Irish population, but think of it in another way. One baby aborted every 3 minutes, 20 every hour, 600 every working day. That's a disaster for all sorts of reasons, but not least for the unborn child and their mother. Both lives matter, and they don't in Britain any longer.
Well, I imagine those who introduced the 67 Act didn't expect what has happened would happen, because many people argue, you know, that won't happen in Ireland and it will be very restrictive, etc., etc. What do you think about that?
Well, they only have to look across the Irish Sea to see how the law of unintended consequences has actually panned out. Because in 1967, if you read the House of Commons debates, the movers said it would only ever be used in the most extreme of circumstances. But in fact, 98% of all abortions, the one that takes place every 3 minutes, the 20 every hour, 98% are done under the social clause. So they have nothing to do with hard cases, nothing to do with a mother's life being at risk, any of those questions. This is under the social clause, and that's what will happen here too. So people need to go in with their eyes wide open. If you repeal the Eighth Amendment, it'll pave the way for abortion on demand and for the destruction of life on a massive scale.
One thing that people mightn't understand is that abortion is actually big business.
It is indeed, and everyone talks about Mary Stopes as though Mary Stopes was some kind of saint. Mary Stopes was a eugenicist. She talked about people like the Irish, Catholics, Jews as being racially negligent. That's a phrase that she used. The eugenicists said that there were certain groups of people who shouldn't be allowed to even reproduce. And so we've lionized her. All these abortion clinics are named after her. And are they a charity? Well, they're registered as such, but you know, a charity that pays its chief executive in 1 year alone over £400,000, that pays 22 of its executives over £100,000, and an industry that in the last 10 years has generated £750 million. It's hard to equate that with charitable activity. This is about money making.
One thing that people would argue is when the law changes, the laws in education and culture will change over time. Tell me a little bit about how the culture in the UK changed, even things like the numbers of abortions. Did it very quickly change, or was it a slow process?
No, it happened very rapidly. Actually, within a year or so, we started to see the average numbers of abortions running at about 150, then 160,000, and it's roughly around 180,000 abortions every year. So that's been systematic. It's been the same over the years, which is why we have this cumulative figure of 8.8 million abortions in 50 years. But it's led to other consequences as well. Once you change the law, well, people think if it's legal, it must be right, and so it becomes normative. So we've got examples of people who have had multiple abortions. The official figures show examples of people who've had 8 legal abortions. So this isn't in extreme circumstances or when your life might be at risk. I mean, this is a regular normative procedure. It becomes even a form of contraception. So this is a horrific state of affairs, but what else does it change? Well, conscience is eroded. So there are no gynecologists or obstetricians left in Britain who are pro-life, because no pro-lifer can go into those professions. The conscience clause doesn't extend beyond doctors, for instance, to midwives. So in Scotland, 2 Scottish midwives lost their jobs because they refused to carry out abortions. Well, you don't go into midwifery to have to carry out abortions. Or think of the journalist recently banned from being able to speak at our most illustrious university, the University of Oxford, because he intended to speak from a pro-life point of view. So it has an effect on things like free speech as well. So right across the piece, you can see the effects that this legislation has. And the truth is that people don't want to hear the alternative argument because they know how powerful our argument actually is.
What would your advice be to the Irish people and indeed our Irish politicians who are going to be looking at this issue in the coming months?
My advice would be to ensure that there is a proper debate that allows both sides to put their point of view and to be heard properly, respectfully, not to remove platforms from people like the former president of UCD, removed from her post because she dared to speak out in favour of life itself. So a proper, honest, open debate. My advice would be to look at the experience in Britain and for Ireland to stand back and say, is this civilised? Is this progressive? Is it a good thing to abort babies up to and even during birth? I mean, this is, for me, unthinkable for a country like Ireland that has always been so affirmative of the right to life itself in its history. So it's a really important time. The Eighth Amendment has been a protection for women and children, and it should stay in the Constitution. Remove it, and the law of unintended consequences will apply here just as it has in the United Kingdom.
Well, Lord Alton, thank you so much for joining us today
My pleasure.
and for coming over to Ireland to share some of your experiences with us.
Thank you.